the evidence continued to mount that for employers, if you wanted to be successful, if you wanted a productive and innovative workforce, you had to do well-being better. And that there was this now growing evidence of this direct correlation between organizational success and profitability and how much you committed to employee well-being. And so employers could no longer ignore their role in employee well-being. Lots of employers maybe for the first time had to face up to like, oh shit, I've got to do something to support my people, because you've got this big cloud of the pandemic and people are working in different locations in a different way, and I don't know how to respond to that. And so we ended up with this kind of perfect storm, I think, all centered around well-being.
Welcome to the HR L&D Podcast with your host, Nick Day, CEO and founder of JGA Recruitment, specialist HR recruiters. Tuning into the HR L&D Podcast will help you to discover strategic growth concepts, leadership development strategies, and the values and behaviours that drive organisational change and success. Together, let's empower our workforces, diversify our thinking, and achieve significant HR success.
Hello and welcome back to the HR L&D Podcast. My name is Nick Day and I'm CEO of JGA Recruitment, a specialist HR recruiter. Now today I'm joined by Gethin Nadin, who is an award-winning psychologist who's been helping some of the world's largest organisations to improve their employee experience and well-being for over 2 decades. Gethin is currently Chief Innovation Officer at Benefex Zellis, and he's a frequent writer and speaker who has tackled pretty much all aspects of the employee experience and employee well-being cycle. He's been featured in Forbes, The Guardian, The Sun, The Huffington Post and The Financial Times, as well as all major HR award and pensions publications. And Gethin has been listed as one of the world's top 101 global employee experience influencers for the last 2 years running. His list on the Employee Engagement Power List is one of LinkedIn's top global contributors, and he's also a regular keynote speaker, ex-chair of the UK government-backed Engage for Success Wellbeing Thought Action Group, a key stakeholder in UK government transport employee wellbeing KPIs, and a fellow of the RSA. Now in 2018, Gethin published his first book, the HR bestseller, A World of Good, Lessons from Around the World in Improving the Employee Experience, which has gone on to inspire HR and award teams at some of the world's best known brands. In 2022, Gethin co-authored his second book, The Humane Office, a collaboration between leading academics and workplace professionals from across Europe. And now he's with me today to talk about his latest book, which has just been released. It's titled A Work in Progress, Unlocking Wellbeing to Create More Sustainable and Resilient Organisations, something which we all know is a huge topic of conversation right now, particularly as we come into the new world of work post-pandemic. It's only just been released, which is why I am super excited to welcome Gethin Nadin to the HR L&D Podcast today, so we can find out more about him, what inspires him in the world of wellbeing and employee engagement, and of course, to talk about that book in more detail. So without further ado, welcome Gethin Nadin to the HR L&D Podcast. How are you feeling today?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I think maybe I should take you around with me everywhere I go, so I get that introduction whenever I enter a room. I think that'd be great.
Fantastic. Well, you're welcome to snippet the recording. You can use it again. But what I'm really excited about today is talk about human resources, talk about employee experience, talk about engagement, all the things I know you're hugely passionate about. Before we jump into your books, though, let me just ask this question, something I ask all my guests on the show, Gethin. What do the words human resources mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think I reflect on the first book. I think one of the opening paragraphs of my first book is something like, people are human and they're not resources. But I think I've kind of evolved that, because I think there's not a day that goes by really that I don't see this debate online about what HR should be called. And I think people are far more obsessed with the semantics of the name of it than actually making a difference, which is a little bit unusual. But I guess for me, I think the description I use once to convince somebody or try to explain to somebody that's not in this industry what it is I always felt like HR is a little bit like a maitre d' for the organisation. So they kind of go up to teams and individuals and just be like, what do you need in order to succeed? Kind of what's missing? Kind of how can I make you more productive? How can I make you happier and well at work? And I think if we get that right, that's where all the good stuff happens. So I almost feel it as this person that hovers over each individual to make sure they've got everything they need to be successful. And I think that's a far cry from 20 years ago when I first got into this industry, where it was more about kind of admin and process and legals and all that kind of stuff. And so that's what I think human resources is to me. I think it's how do we take better care of the people that are working with us.
Super, fantastic. Well, let's focus a little bit there on what you've just mentioned, because of how you came into the industry over 2 decades ago. I want to get into the books and where we are now, but tell us, the listeners, a little bit about your journey that's got you from your starting point in HR all the way through to a very successful keynote speaker and published author.
There's a bit of art and drama in my background in early days of school, which probably plays into why I like standing on a stage and having attention. It really felt like it started for me when, at the age of 23, I got given an opportunity to get some management training fully funded by my then employer, Legal & General. And my boss at the time didn't want me to have this training. It was funded partly by the Welsh government, so it was kind of something in the region of back then 25 grand's worth of training. So, a sizable amount of money that was being paid to the Welsh government. My boss told me not to go for that training, didn't think I was ready. I found out that I didn't need my boss's approval. I could go straight and apply for that myself. I did that, got that training, came back, took my boss's job, became the manager of the team that I was in. And that first 12 months that I had as a manager, our workplace trainer used to always, and I'm still close to him now, used to always describe me as having, a lifetime's worth of management experience in one 12-month period. I had to deal with things like drugs at work. I had a member of the team that was a porn star. We had people who had some pretty serious mental health conditions. People had eating disorders, and in a very small team had just a lot of issues, but a high-performing team, and many times the highest-performing team we had in the department at the time. And I had one situation in particular that always sticks out, where one girl came to work crying one day because the local council had finally caught up with her. She hadn't paid council tax for 7 years in all the different places she'd lived, and she'd received a court summons that day. And she was obviously devastated by this, didn't know how she was what would happen if she went to court, obviously worried about kind of the worst end of that, would she go to prison and stuff like that. And my boss at the time said, look, just send her home. She's no good to anyone. She's just got to go and sort it out. And even as a 23-year-old manager with not much training, that just felt like the wrong way of dealing with this situation. So, I used our not very used at the time EAP, and just got on the phone call in a conference call with this girl on a conference call with the EAP provider, and just kind of had an open conversation about what her options were. They put us in touch with the Citizens Advice Bureau. And what we were able to negotiate then is actually they got the council to cancel the court action, put a payment plan in place, told that girl to kind of go and take a long lunch break, sit in a park, have a sandwich, kind of put yourself together, it's over, we've sorted this now, you've got a way out. And then she came back to work, but she came back to work feeling like we as the business and I had helped her and got her to a better place. And that's really, I think, what started to shape we've got to do better for people. And then added to that over the years, my own experiences of being treated pretty poorly at work really kind of drove this. Employers have got a pretty unique opportunity to make a material difference to people's lives. And that's what really kind of took me for this kind of winding path to where I am now. And I hope part of the reason why I'm successful is because I genuinely care about this. I don't want people to go through some of the stuff that I and many others have at work, where work becomes a really devastating part of people's lives when they get it wrong. And so that's kind of where it's been driving me, really.
Fantastic example. And what I hear there as well is, and what I love from the response is, you've broken the norm a little bit there. You haven't just followed the path of least resistance, which would be, I don't need to do that course because someone said no, or I don't need to look and see if I can help that employee. Actually, if we can do something, let's make some calls. Let's see what we can do. You take a very proactive HR responsive approach, which I think is great. Obviously, you've done that with your books as well, and you've really found a passion, probably because you were exposed to it early doors potentially, but a real passion then for employee engagement and seeing the impact that can have. What was it, that kind of work then that led you into your first book? Because interestingly, you titled that A World of Good, Lessons from Around the World and Improving the Employee Experience. Now, if I understand it correctly, that was all about improving the employee experience so people can show up to be the best version of themselves each day at work, which I'm assuming that lady individual, the female individual you just mentioned then, was able to do after you took some of that anxiety away from her in relation to being able to resolve that particular issue. Tell me a little bit more about the book and I guess in particular some of the lessons you've learned from around the world and about the employee experience journey that book takes the reader through.
Yeah, so that book came out of, there was a period of time when I was working, my early days at Benefex, when I was working in sales. And so I was working a lot with reward and benefit teams and HR teams and, problem solving, as many salespeople do, for those customers and those employers. And part of my role then was to set up partnerships. And I set up partnerships globally with people like Barclays and EY and PwC who would go and resell our technology. So I got really into that. And I think pretty successful. Some of those partnerships had never been set up before that time and haven't been since. And so it was kind of a little bit record breaking for us to establish those kind of global partners with those, very big organizations. And so I really felt like, as well as this keen interest, my knowledge had to get better, because it was a little bit like, if I was selling to somebody, I had to know so much. But if I was selling to somebody to convince all of their kind of getting them to convince all their customers to then buy from us, I needed to go a bit deeper. I wasn't just a car salesman. I guess I needed to be a mechanic as well, if you like, if that is an analogy that works. And so the more I did of that, and the more I spent with global employers, the more I kept seeing, like, why do people keep making the same mistakes? And I was seeing, small businesses didn't have the exposure to the kind of resources and that your Googles and LinkedIn's did. So, most books were full of these big American company examples that were actually pretty, most small British companies, as an example, couldn't relate to that stuff.
Sure.
And then I just started really looking at, a time, 2016, when the UK was pulling itself apart from the rest of the world through the Brexit referendum. It really felt like, I had this strong belief that people are the same wherever you go. And I don't think it mattered whether you worked in Sweden, whether you worked in America or the UK. People wanted the same from work. And so I started looking back at the kind of what I keep calling the tribe and fire of humans, about what do humans always wanted in their lives. And the first story that really struck me, being a Welshman myself, was the story of a guy called Robert Owen, who was a social reformer, born in Wales, ended up marrying a woman north of England, Lanarkshire, I think it was, took over the mills from her father, became a kind of big mill owner in the region. And he just started to see his people almost in the same way, and I'm not comparing myself to Robert Owen at all, but almost in the same way that I saw that individual struggle and thought there's got to be a better way of handling this. He saw the same thing. And so he set about creating the first workplace nursery. So people came to work and didn't have to worry about or have the expense of childcare. And he started offering free classes and education at school, and an on-site shop that was non-for-profit, so people didn't have to waste any of their hard-earned income paying for milk and bread. And this was a guy who, on his deathbed, the major economist at the time basically said, "You've wasted your life. All these experimental socialist things you've been doing, you've wasted your life." But shortly after, a guy from America came over to visit his mills to see what he'd been doing, realized he'd shortened the working day from 12 hours to 8 to 10 hours, and his people had been happier and productive as a result. And that man took that back to America and put it in his factories, and that man was Henry Ford. And so I was a little bit okay, so we're like looking forwards at how do we develop the workplace, and we're getting friction against the shorter working day and the shorter working week. But it just felt like this is the next evolution of what has always happened for 100 years. We've gone from 12 hours, and we've gone from 7 days a week to 5 days a week and 8 hours a day. So if technology is advancing, why aren't we moving with that and allowing people to live better lives and arguably produce more? And then the more I looked around the world, the more I found that actually there were communities in Africa that did stuff that could teach us about the workplace. And there were practices in Sweden and Denmark that were allowing us to understand a little bit more about, well, actually, if we did these things, maybe we have a better workplace. So it was very much this idea of, if we want to get ahead, maybe we should be looking back. I think we should probably learn a lot from history. And I guess the new book is just a deeper kind of almost a double click on some of that stuff, which is actually, when you look more deeply, not just at the employee experience, but the well-being experience at work. Again, we've kind of led ourselves to understand well-being in a way that's probably not really well-being in my view. And so how do we actually look back to kind of get ahead? And so they're kind of companion books, I guess, in that sense.
So what was it that led you in your journey to putting all of this, pen to paper, so to speak? And you're working in sales, you're dealing with all these different clients that are adopting these new sort of benefit offerings and employee engagement methods and process and things like that. There are lots of people, I'm sure, listening to this, working in senior HR, reward, benefits-related roles, or living roles, who probably have a book within them but don't know where to start. But you actually, as it's come across already, Gethin, you're very proactive and you don't always follow the normal route. But at some point, there must have been a moment where you got, you know what, I'm going to commit this to paper. And your journey into becoming now a published author of 3 books began in this world that you're clearly very passionate about. Tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, that's quite a good question, because I don't talk about this very often, but it was actually my own poor well-being that led to me writing the first book. So as well as gaining all this knowledge, and I kind of started then putting what I thought was interesting out there in kind of blogs and LinkedIn articles, and that started to get some engagement. And then obviously my employer was then a little bit like, oh, maybe you should write a little bit more. And then our CEO was like, maybe you should now start talk about stuff so I don't have to get up and talk about it. And so that naturally started to happen. And the more you do that and the deeper you get into it, the more I'm at a point now where I could easily stand up tomorrow at a conference and not know what I was going to speak about, but hopefully still speak for 45 minutes on something that was interesting.
Nice.
And so I started to get a lot of anxiety about work for the first time ever. And it kind of came out of nowhere. There was no real obvious driver for it, but I almost felt like I lost a little bit of my purpose at work. I was bored of sales. I didn't like sales anymore. I felt like I'd done that. And I just started to get really anxious and had this weird feeling that I was going to lose my job, even though the business was like, we love you, you're great. Like, why are you feeling like this? So whether it's imposter syndrome or something, I don't know. But yeah, I think it was an echo of some of the bad treatment I'd had previously, because I started to feel the same way I'd felt like almost 8 years before because of the way it worked. So I felt like I just needed something outside of work. I felt like my life was being determined quite a lot by work. The way I identify was related a lot to my job. People would ask me how I was, and my immediate response was how well work was going. I was never really talking about me and stuff like that. And so I found that work was dominating conversations with family and friends. And so that's when I decided, I've written a few of these art blogs and stuff. They've got good interest. Maybe it's time to write a book. And it became almost a therapy. It just became a way of taking me away from work and thinking about stuff. And I remember one particular time where I was away in Manchester with work, and I'd got bored of writing the book. I was about 6 months into it. I'd kind of slowed right down. I got bored of it. And the apartment I was staying in Manchester was, it turned out to be a horrible place, dead flies everywhere. I didn't want to stay in there. And so I thought, well, I'm not going to sit here all evening. So I went out, sat in a Starbucks, and literally had nothing to do. So I thought maybe I'll pick the book up again. And that really kind of kick-started me to finish the book and over the next couple of months. And it was self-published, and it was literally a case of I had no idea how it was going to land. I found it incredibly difficult to write. It was very difficult to kind of publish, and I had to use my own money to pay for a graphic designer and a proofreader. And the early days, there were still mistakes in it, which happens quite a lot. And the expectation was, if you write a book, and you self-publish, you're probably going to sell about 100 copies, and they're largely just going to be family and friends who are going to buy the book because they like you and they want to support you. And so I didn't really tell anyone it was happening until the day it was released, and then put something on LinkedIn, and a network of people that continued to kind of lift me up and support me bought that book and shared it, and people started to really like it. And then within its first month, went on the Amazon bestseller list. I remember a pinpoint for me was I got a message from a HR leader in, I think it was Burberry, and I didn't know this person, hadn't connected with them, and they basically said, I've just devoured your book in a day and I loved it. And they were like, you're talking about things in a different way. People were saying it was easy to read. It read more like a novel than it did kind of a textbook, which is what I think a lot of HR books end up being like.
Yeah.
And that was obviously the point where I thought, okay, maybe this is it. And actually what that led to was me getting so much more confidence in myself and my abilities that I destroyed those feelings of anxiety, flipped it on its head, and started to believe in myself to the extent that I was like, I'm not worried that this company is going to fire me. This company's lucky to have me, And my boss said it to me one day. He said, we're lucky you're here. We're lucky you haven't found somewhere else to work. And I actually ended up doing a bit of counselling for a couple of months after that. But that book was, I don't know, it saved me in many ways, I think, and gave me much more of a purpose than I had before. And I think for anyone that's got something to write, even if you wrote a book for yourself, you published it, and you just kept one copy to yourself and no one else ever bought it, you've got something. And I think somebody messaged me, again, somebody I didn't know on Twitter at the time, and said, look, I don't know you, but I just want to let you know you've written a book, and no matter what happens in your life, you will always have the book, and the book will always be there. And then somebody reminded me of a Banksy quote, which was, you die twice. You die once when you actually physically die, and you die again when somebody mentions your name for the last time. And somebody said that to me and said, if you've got a book, your name is going to be mentioned again long after you've gone, because people don't throw away books. Someone will keep that book and it'll go to a charity shop or somebody else's shelf. And yeah, that was just like one of the greatest things to happen to me, I think. And I think for anyone who thinks they've got a book in them, I found it quite cathartic, and I hope others would as well. But yeah, write it. There's loads of good books out there, but there's also a load of rubbish books. So I think we need more good books.
Well, sure, it's a brilliant story. I'm glad I asked the question. I feel a bit nervous. I'm picking a psychologist here, but a couple of things I've picked out of your response, if you don't mind me just exploring slightly further. The first is credit to you with the books, because I think you did them from the right place. You didn't write them for profit. When you mentioned 100 books, you wrote them for you. And that's often, I think, the best books come out of that journey. They've been a little bit more authentic and they've really spoken to people. So well done and congratulations on getting the first one out, because it's led to you to writing two excellent books after that, which we're going to get into in just a moment. Some of the things I picked up on what you mentioned there, though. The first was purpose. You mentioned that you're questioning your purpose, and you also mentioned that maybe potentially you're suffering a little bit of imposter syndrome. Often, actually, I think when we see it, it's rare for men actually to admit they suffer from imposter syndrome. We hide it under different guises or under different terms. So I was really glad you brought that to the surface, because whatever gender you are, wherever you associate yourself, imposter syndrome is there, and it exists in many forms, regardless of your seniority. And arguably, sometimes the further up the hierarchical ladder you go, the more imposter syndrome can start to present itself. And I'm sure there'll be people here in very senior positions that are almost embarrassed or frightened about bringing that up. But don't worry, no matter where you are, you're Chief Innovation Officer, I'm a Managing Director here, and I certainly have suffered from it in the past, and you have as well. So thank you for bringing that to raise awareness of something that I think exists with many people. What I thought was really interesting, though, you mentioned that your purpose was suffering. And, I've looked at coaching and I do these podcasts, and there's something that resonates with me, which is the LEAP model, which you may or may not be familiar with, which is an axis that has learning at the top, enjoyment, purpose as well, and you've got achievement. And I think it's really interesting. Even your purpose, you felt you were questioning it. You also mentioned the enjoyment of your role had dropped. And I think for many, if your purpose is questioned, then actually you do start to question whether you enjoy your job. I think they're really closely related. Yeah. But what you went and did on that LEAP model is you went and started to learn and research more, which you did. You achieved your book, which ticks off the A, and you found your purpose and enjoyment again. And I think it really crystallized that vision for me on that LEAP model. For those who aren't familiar, we're going to have a look at it. I'll try and put a link in the show notes. But actually, it allowed you to find your purpose again. And I think that was really interesting for those that are struggling, actually trying to learn more, trying to just reevaluate where you are, and whether that's through research, whether that's through questioning others. If you're able to refine that purpose, it can lead to some wonderful things, which it clearly has done in your instance. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, completely. I've always been, I talk about this in the first book, I've always been a big believer in, we've let work define people, right? I think one of the examples I put in the first book is, if you go on a game show, it's like, Nick, kind of, what's your name? Where do you come from? Like, what do you do? It's the country you live or the city you live, your name and your job. And they're the only real defining factors that people ask for in the kind of interview and stuff. And you've obviously got this like pop idol, American Idol type trope, which is like, do what you want to do, do what you love. And people love singing and they go on that program, but they're not very good at singing. And so it's a little bit like, I hate this idea that you've got to follow your passion and stuff. I think, you can love what you do rather than do what you love. I think people can find joy and purpose in the most mundane jobs. And I think, I never grew up, my background is a psychology degree, worked in television. Television's what I wanted to work in, fell into kind of insurance and then pensions and employee benefits and then kind of HR tech. Me as a 10-year-old boy never wanted to do any of that stuff. That was never on my kind of purpose roadmap. But I tried lots of things and I found what I loved. And I think in my early days of Legal & General, I had a little bit of this, and I couldn't work in television anymore. I wasn't getting the contracts. I needed to find a job. I found a job in an office, and then I found a way to learn that job. And for me, that was like, I'm going to go on this management course. I'm going to try and make this work. The last thing didn't work. So what do I do to make this work? And I really enjoyed that first couple of years. And then again, felt a little bit like I just wasn't enjoying it as much as I used to. And so I went back to night school and did a couple of courses on kind of change management and international business and things like that. And, I paid for those myself. I took myself to those. And then that's when I realized it was learning is what I enjoyed, which was really surprising. Yeah. I didn't necessarily ever feel like I liked that at school. I found university quite difficult. And I guess researching for the book and writing a book is just an extension of that learning, right? And wanting to learn more. And even now I find it difficult to read novels, because I feel like if I read a novel, I haven't become better at the end of it, which I know sounds really bad, because I know there's lots of books out there that will make you a better person. But that's why I read a lot of business books, because I'm reading things that I want to be better for the thing that I've done. So it's not wasted time, if you like. So the book is partly satisfying that need, but also, if I'm being completely honest, satisfying that ego need of me writing stuff and saying, well done, I like what you said.
I mean, ultimately, though, if you love what you do, you end up doing what you love anyway. It's just looking at it a different way. And that's, that presents itself in your second book. Let's talk about that briefly, because your second book, and I think it builds on that purpose thing you found. Your first book, you said, was very well received by the HR community. You then released a second book called The Humane Office. So the human with an E in brackets. Was that harder to write, or now that you'd found that purpose, did that come a little bit more naturally to you?
I call it second in inverted commas because there was kind of 10 authors and we all contributed to it. So, I didn't have to write much for that, but I think the pandemic experience gave me a lot of things that I was burning to ask or say. So that bit was pretty straightforward. This, in inverted commas, third book, or 2.5, or whatever you want to call it, was a lot harder to write. And actually, reflecting on it, one of the most stressful things I've ever done. It came at a time when I was doing... Work was very busy. Whilst I was writing this book, my mother got an Alzheimer's diagnosis, and that was really difficult for the family to deal with.
Sorry to hear that.
And so, thank you. And so it's still quite raw now. So I'm trying not to cry in your podcast, but I was writing the book whilst all this stuff was happening. And I would maybe argue that it changed the direction of the book a little bit, because I was living through an experience that I was trying to solve with the book. I was basically living through an experience where I was like, what do I need my employer to be doing at this point? Whilst also writing a book that was hopefully advising other employers, this is what you should be doing when your people are struggling. And so it was kind of, it's probably in a bad way, but it was serendipitous in the fact that I was able to experience for the first time in my life my own biggest well-being struggle at work, whilst actually writing about how we should help other people with that. And aside from that, there was obviously huge pressure I put on myself because the first book did so well.
Sure.
I needed this one to do.
That second book syndrome,
Yeah, exactly. And kept going. But the one thing I didn't really struggle with is, as I was writing it, because it was based on all the time I'd spent with HR and reward and benefits and wellbeing teams, the thousands of hours I'd done in kind of wellbeing consulting during the pandemic, all the research and stuff I'd been reading during that time, the 200 or so conference talks that I'd given. It was all based on that experience. And some of that experience was helping people at the coalface. So it wasn't just theory. There were practical applications of this. And so I don't think I ever thought it was not going to be a good book, because it was so evidence-based and it was so based on my own experiences. I didn't feel like people could disagree with it. I wasn't interpreting things necessarily. I was basically saying, just this is what I learned. And that was my experience. So it's not right or wrong. You might not want to apply it to your business, but it was factual, I guess, in many ways. But as it started to kind of come to print and stuff, it was just, a huge amount of pressure, a lot going on. And so, now it's out there and it's in people's hands, and the early reviews came in and they were quite positive. It's a relief. The first book, I was really excited to get it out. This is generally more like a relief that it's out there, just because of all the stuff that was going on. And quite frankly as well, glad that my mother's at the moment in a place where she understands that I've written a book and what the book's about, and is able to kind of hold it and comprehend it, because that's not going to last for long either.
No, well done on that. It's a fantastic achievement. And for those not familiar, there will be a link in the show notes here, but the latest book is titled A Work in Progress, Unlocking Wellbeing to Create More Sustainable and Resilient Organizations. And you mentioned that, let's be fair, the pandemic has changed a lot of the workplace. Certainly I work in recruitment, so I've seen everything change in the world of work, from the way that people are managed through to where people are working from, all the different things. And we know that well-being's been significantly impacted as a result of that, of the crisis, and not just on the individual, but also on how employers must now react to employee well-being. Tell me a little bit more about some of the findings that you found, and how some of the commentary perhaps you provide us in your book.
Yeah, I mean, from all the data we have, and it's quite a lot, I think I've referenced almost 600 different studies in the book. The pandemic changed the workplace and well-being significantly. It led to us as consumers having kind of more agency over our well-being. We know that throughout the pandemic, people digested more content online than they ever have, and a lot of that was health and well-being content. We kind of had no option but to become better informed of our own well-being in order to protect ourselves throughout the pandemic. And that led to some pretty significant change in employee expectations. So one of the studies I quote in the book, 92% of employees globally said that a commitment to well-being was now the number one thing they expected to get from an organization. So more than kind of pay and benefits, that was kind of what they wanted was, if I'm going to work with you, I want you to take care of me, whether that's the next pandemic, whether that's me going through a divorce, whether that's my mother getting Alzheimer's. I want you to be there for me. If you're not going to look after me when I'm struggling, why would I give you my best, type of thing?
Yeah.
And so I think it's significant now that well-being is core to that employee value proposition. And alongside that, the evidence continued to mount that for employers, if you wanted to be successful, if you wanted a productive and innovative workforce, you had to do well-being better. And there was this now growing evidence of this direct correlation between organizational success and profitability and how much you committed to employee well-being. And so employers could no longer ignore their role in employee well-being. Lots of employers maybe for the first time had to face up to like, oh shit, I've got to do something to support my people because you've got this big cloud of the pandemic and people are working in different locations in a different way and I don't know how to respond to that. And so we ended up with this kind of perfect storm, I think, all centered around well-being. And I think so employers said that they spent more on supporting their staff. Employees said they needed more support. State and government support, especially in the UK, but throughout the world, was just waning. It's just not anywhere where it needs to be, especially for mental health. And I think more generally, this period of quiet reflection that most people went through was, what am I working here for? Like, what if this business isn't taking care of me? Like, what's the point in doing this? I can get a salary anywhere. So why aren't I working elsewhere? And I actively encouraged friends and family who were thinking that way to, you've got to leave, right? Because as soon as the pandemic started to come to an end, we had a really good hiring environment. And I was encouraging everyone I knew to, do you know what? Don't think twice. Get out. If you don't think they appreciate you, they don't deserve you. And I'm happy to say about 6 of my close friends left their jobs and immediately found better jobs with employers that take care of them or paid them more. And that was kind of pretty magical, I think. But I think, a lot of that empowerment message isn't out there for most employees. Managers like myself, when I was a manager and a manager now, have never really been trained on being a manager and how to look care of people's well-being. It's not part of my success metric as a manager to take care of myself. And so I felt like there's all this stuff out there, these 600 studies that I read that, most HR people aren't going to read because they're famously time poor and under-resourced. So how could I create this book that, I could give you the highlights and the evidence is there so you could build the business case to get the investment, to get the attention that you needed. And they were the biggest challenges I found with these wellbeing workshops is the individuals were like, yeah, I want to do it. I know why we need to do it, but I'm struggling to convince other people in my business. The book was really this kind of handbook that would go on that journey with you. And you could almost, for anyone who said well-being is not a thing or this is not worth spending, you could get the book and hit that person in the face with the book and say, well, the evidence is there. And it's pretty clear that if we don't do this, we're going to be left behind as a business.
Yeah, it's a great example. I think you mentioned, we've seen it as recruiters, right? So, coming out of the pandemic, the great resignation is, or the great awakening, which I think is what we term it. And I think the way that you've highlighted it there, the realization that actually, if my employer isn't looking after me, I can go somewhere else. And absolutely you can. There is and it's such a cliche, I hate using it, but a war on talent in quotation marks. And that's been out there now. And employers have had to change in order not just to attract new staff, but to retain existing employees. And it's been a fantastic shift in the workplace, in workplace culture. You mentioned there as well, was quite interesting is, people aren't often trained to be managers of well-being in the same way. That's not part of their metric. And actually, I think we certainly are moving away from a command and control environment into a more coaching-based sort of culture now. I'd be really interested to know from the 600 bits of information and research that you took and the stats and studies that you researched. You mentioned just a moment ago that the 92% say that it's absolutely top of their agenda and that it has to change. But from that research, although people know they have to do something, doesn't necessarily mean that they do anything about it. I know it's there. So are you seeing change from that research? And is there any studies that come back to say, actually, those that are making the adjustments are seeing some fantastic results?
Have you ever asked yourself, how can any recruiter understand my HR recruitment challenges? Please don't give up on your hiring challenges just yet. Here at JGA HR Recruitment, we appreciate the difficulties associated with attracting, recruiting and retaining top human resources talent. We also understand just how costly a poor hire can be. JGA HR Recruitment would like to partner with you to help you overcome your hiring challenges. Contact us today on 01727 800 377 or visit jgarecruitment.com to find out more.
Yeah, the customers, the global employers that I work with who got well-being and had a strategy in place, they weathered the pandemic storm better than other employers.
Right.
They had the support in place. They knew where to direct people. It was almost like, people go through drills and fire drills and stuff like that, so they know what to do should the worst happen. And it's almost like those people who had those strategies already knew this. So whilst everyone else was like clambering around trying to find the fire extinguisher and read the instructions to put out the fire, other people were like, look, we know what to do. We've got this thing in place. You know what support is available. And they didn't fall into this trap of like panic buying things and just buying mental health apps because they needed to be seen to be doing something. But I think some of the evidence that came out in the book that I find the most fascinating, and I appreciate this might not be the same for other people, is one of them was the huge impact that things like health insurance can have on employees. So in the state of Oregon, there was a group of researchers that offered fully paid health insurance to about 100,000 people right across the state. So they held a statewide lottery. I think about 500,000 people entered. They randomly chose 100,000 people, gave them fully paid health insurance, and then just watched and sat back and observed and saw what happened over the next couple of years. And they found after just 1 year that not only did everyone who got health insurance actually report that they were healthier and happier than the people that didn't get health insurance, they were also under less financial strain. Now, that last bit is very American because obviously health insurance is expensive, but, you know, they were finding that actually people were happier and healthier. But what they also found out after 2 years was that those people who were insured sought treatment earlier, which lowered their chances of falling more seriously ill. The researchers found that having health insurance in place made more people likely to be admitted to hospital, but that was because the newly insured used almost every kind of healthcare service. So when they didn't have to pay for it, when they weren't worried about timing and cost, they were like, well, maybe I will have that scan just to check everything's okay. And so they were actively more proactive. So there were really big jumps in the numbers of people seeking out preventative care, you know, things like mammograms and just visiting the doctor more regularly. But then they found that because of that, that changed their behaviors, and those people became more proactive more generally with their health. So those people were actually looking after their health better because they were taking more preventative measures. And the researchers found that even for those people that didn't use it, just having health insurance in place decreased their chances of developing a mental health condition and improved the likelihood that they would say a self-report after 2 years that their health was excellent. And then they also found like the number of sick days that people went through dropped. So again, the amount of money saved for those people who were employed actually was less than it would cost to give those individuals health insurance. So what you actually found was paying for health insurance is a very big cost for the employer, but out the back end, you were getting less sick days, happier people, more productivity, which was actually cancelling out the cost in many cases. And so while that, you know, as an example, that benefit was making life significantly better for employees and employers, even though it was an expensive benefit, I just think that's fascinating. And that requires us to think differently about how we spend money and how we get it back, what that return on investment looks like.
Sure. I have to ask, do you know if the company in question in Oregon then rolled it out on the basis of that study to the other 5,000 employees?
Well, so it was randomly across the state of Oregon. So some of those people were employed, some of those people weren't.
So I misunderstood that, of course.
But there's some great examples in, like, they've done this in a city called Alberta Lee in Minnesota as well, where they just encourage people to spend more time with each other to build more community and things like that. And again, they found that employers in those regions were paying less for health insurance because their people were healthier. Just because they were spending more time with their neighbours. And, you know, this harks to this tribe and fire that I was talking about at the start, which is, you know, if that kind of stuff is having such a big impact, that's not this commodified version of well-being we've all been led to believe, where you've got apps and mental health apps. This is just spending time with people. So why do employers need to spend loads of money to facilitate that? And so I think it's an example of how, if we just think about things a little bit differently, we can achieve better results. And the other big study, which really fascinated me, was what's being called now a pretty kind of landmark study, which was published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. And, you know, when this was published, it, you know, quote, had healthcare professionals and doctors around the world staggered by its results. And the study looked at almost 200,000 patients who spoke either French or English. And the researchers found that when a French-speaking doctor treated French-speaking patients, they had a 24% lower chance of dying in hospital compared to when non-French-speaking doctors were treating French speakers. And the odds were more than doubled among French or English speakers, so rising to something like 54% lower chance of death if a person was treated in their native language.
Wow.
And that is huge, right? That's, you know, I think that study highlights just how important it is for us as employers to make sure that well-being and diversity is kind of crossed, and that representation in access to healthcare. So if I'm phoning in EAP and English isn't my first language, if I'm speaking to a counsellor and I'm a black employee and I want to be able to speak to a black counsellor who's had lived experiences, all that stuff becomes really, really important. I'm still not entirely sure how that translates into the workplace, but from a societal level, I just thought that was fascinating.
It is. I think from listening to it, one thing that's come really clear, this won't be shocking, I'm sure, for anyone listening to this, but I don't think it harms to refocus the point, which is happy employees tend to result in more productive employees. And not fear. Fear doesn't work. And if you use that example with the doctors, if you can't be understood, then I would imagine it exacerbates the fear and the anxiety. Whereas if you are understood, if communication channels are really clear and understood, then you're able to alleviate that fear. Similarly, on the health insurance side, clearly those employees that got it were able to feel happier, and therefore they're able to be more productive in their work. It's a win-win scenario. And yet years ago, even when I first started recruitment 20 years ago, I would say there were more departments then running through fear. You will lose your job if you don't do X. But now it's been a massive shift. And I'm so thankful it's happened, because it's absolutely the right way to go. People should feel comfortable at work, happy at work, supported at work with good communication, and it allows them to perform optimally. And I think for me, that's the reference I took from your doctor's example. For me, if my doctor didn't understand me and I can understand them, I know straight away just the person I am, I would feel more anxious and more fearful. And how that manifests itself in my body and in terms of my healthcare, I don't know, but I know how I would feel as an individual.
Yeah, and there's an element of trust which underpins a lot of well work. But you look at people started to distrust a lot of big organizations like the World Health Organization during the pandemic, because there was so much kind of clickbait and fake news about the pandemic and the virus itself. I think part of the reason why that content boom happened, where people were watching more videos and consuming more content, was part because we probably had a little bit more time, but also because people had to become well informed. And that has actually led to, I think, this future where people are taking more control over their own well-being. And, if you look at the data around health literacy, a lot of what happens in our lives can be prevented by us having improved level of knowledge about health matters, which consequently will change our behaviors. So another big study that came out, and I put this in the book very recently, was we now officially know that more than half of the reason why people get cancer is completely within their control to change. And so again, we've got to this point where people accepted almost that things like depression and cancer were in the family and you're more likely to get it. But actually, more than half of cancers can be prevented by people just becoming better informed and changing their behaviors as a result. And with cancer being such a big risk to all of us, 1 in 2 will get some kind of cancer in our lifetimes. The fact that we can prevent that starts to tell me that, well, actually, employers can prevent that, because employers have a unique opportunity to help people understand the risks to cancer and how do we change that. And through many of the benefit type things that many employers will have, health insurance and otherwise, and income protection, all these kind of traditional benefits, we can change that. We as employers, if you did a few things in your company and 3 people didn't get cancer because of the way that you'd help them become more informed, which subsequently changed some of their behaviors, that's far more significant than some of the things we look at in the workplace around reducing some working days off and that kind of stuff. I've got a friend at the moment who's going through cancer who had an income protection payout. That money's now run out and he has to go back to work. So he's still under treatment, but has to go back to work because he can't afford not to. And we just shouldn't be in that situation. In my view, that employer should be stepping up and saying there's a better way of doing this. And I think investing in those people and supporting them, the vast majority of those will come back to you as better people, come back to you as grateful people that will work harder and be more committed and loyal to you because you really helped them. We are still pulling against, exactly as you said, this command and control nature, which is more a kind of, let's trust everyone from the start and give everyone the support equally and help everyone as much as we possibly can. Treat them as individuals, whether that's the language they speak, whether that's like adjusting things because of the color of their skin or their sexuality, which, anything that marginalizes somebody makes their well-being worse. So we have to be mindful of all those things. Then that's what we're trying to get through. So I completely agree with what you just said.
And also, I think, as you've proven in your career, Gethin, is don't be confined by your job description. Just because your job description says no doesn't mean you can't go and do these things and be more supportive. And if you need to go outside of that to be the individual or the manager that you want to be, which allows me helping you with staff, then go do that. And you mentioned that knowledge is the key to unlocking enlightenment and key to power and improving. What then is the key kind of takeaway that people can really get from your book? That it's out now, people can go and access it. What's the one thing you'd like everyone to take away from your book?
I guess it's I guess it's that well-being is far more in the micro things we do as employers and less in the stuff we can go out and buy. I think the way we structure organizations, the daily ways we treat people, the way we write policies, the way we try to bring people together, especially now in this kind of hybrid post-pandemic world. The pandemic meant that people had to go and act quickly, and that meant buying stuff and putting things in place and just kind of trying to keep that kind of wolf from the door throughout the pandemic. And I think it's now a moment of kind of pause and reflect on the pandemic experience and to take a breath a little bit and almost to take time to get back to what well-being really is, what people really need in their lives and from work, what the crisis taught us about what well-being needs to look like at work. And I think it's also a practical guide. So it's not just full of evidence and research. It has contributions of many global well-being experts from companies like Serco, Ocado, Philip Morris International, as well as kind of my own meandering experience helping global employers at this kind of coalface of well-being. And so it's hopefully a balanced view. It's not just mine. There are views of others to kind of balance out some of the things that I'm saying. But, the vast majority is evidence-based. So it's my own practical experience, all the evidence and the views of many others. But, even as a starting point, it's got a whole chapter dedicated to how do we define well-being, because there's no universally agreed definition of well-being, let alone well-being at work. So I'm trying to encourage people to first understand and create their own definition of well-being before they start that journey of trying to improve it.
No, so it's just a great response. I feel a bit bad for asking this question now. It may come across a little bit aggressive, so apologies, but I'm going to ask it anyway because, post-pandemic, I've interviewed a number of authors and I've seen a plethora of new HR and well-being based books hit the market. I know because I understand where your book is coming from, but I don't want to answer the question for my audience. I want you to be the one that brings us to the light. So why is your book different from the others? Why should people really take note of your book over the others that have been released on well-being? There's a lot out there at the moment. Yeah, just explain a little bit to the audience as to why yours, I guess, speaks for itself on the shelf.
I guess the first thing I think was, and this was the same as when I wrote the first book, is back to this. I wanted to write the book that I wanted to read. And I think, as you've mentioned, I think that's always really, really important. And I think I found a lot of HR books pretty inaccessible. They were full of case studies. And like I say, they were mentioning case studies like Netflix and Google and Amazon. And we're like, these are big companies with huge resources. They can be very experimental. Most people don't work for a business like that. So actually, I'm not entirely sure sometimes what that stuff tells us. But it also had to be a bit more accessible. And so the format for the first book, and I think I've translated this to this third one, was chapters I wanted to be read quite easily. It was very much a pick up and put down book. So people could sit on a commute, people could sit on a lunch break, read a bit of the book, put it down. I wanted the kind of book that people wrote on, that they put post-it notes in, that became dog-eared and chucked in a bag and things like that. I didn't want it full of kind of graphs and tables and overladen with science. All these studies I quoted, it's 600 different studies, I would read a study and it would be fascinating. I'd look at, as a psychologist, I'd be kicking the tires of what was the sample size like? Did they kind of ask the right questions? And I didn't want to include studies that I didn't think had kind of asked the right questions or to the right people. Yeah. But most people don't need to know that, right? Most people just wanted, like, what's the headline? What's this study telling me? And so I wanted to kind of double tap on those kind of water cooler experiences where somebody would read a chapter and then would go to somebody and say, did you know this? And just regale that one sentence, because they don't need to know the study. The study's referenced, you can go and read it. It's easy to find, but people aren't going to read pages and pages of scientific literature, especially if they don't have a science or research background, because this stuff's boring and it's very difficult to read. There are lots of studies I had to read the abstracts and the content quite a few times to really understand what's the result here, kind of what's the outcome, what's it telling me. And so I wanted it to be written like that. One of my friend's dads, who I spent some time with over the summer, bought my first book without me knowing. And I met up with her recently, and she basically shook her head and said, I'm sick of my dad texting me things like you said in the book. They'll go out for dinner together and he'll be like, wow, Gethin says this. And that's exactly what I wanted to happen. I wanted people just to remember those short, succinct kind of phrases and sound bites. And so all of this, I think, applied to the second. But I also wanted to remove other common barriers, I thought, to kind of getting anyone to read the book. So as well as it being easy to read and accessible, I wanted it to be cheap. I think far too many HR books are very expensive. There's a well-known publisher in the HR space that seems to be charging kind of £25 to £40 per book. And I just think think that again removes barriers to people accessing it. This book, the paperback version of this book, is pretty much at cost price. I'll be completely honest, that I make like literally pennies for the paperback. And so it's not about generating income. It's about getting that knowledge out. So it makes a difference. If more people listen to what's in the book, more employees will have a better experience at work. And I guess largely it was about, it's a call to anyone, I think, about how important they can be to their organization if they really understand well-being from the ground up. And I think it's also a call to understanding that I think HR genuinely is making a difference to society. I think when an employee treats its people well, when it pays them fairly, when it gives them that purpose and opportunity to develop, people are taking that stuff home. And the evidence is there that when somebody gets recognized more at work and feels appreciated, a father will have a better relationship with their kids. And so we're making society better through the things that we do in HR. And I really believe that. And I think hopefully from some of the early reviews, the book is starting to do that.
Yeah, no, fantastic. I couldn't agree more. I think what's lovely as well is, as you mentioned, you've done a lot of the heavy lifting in the research. That's what makes it really, digestible as a reader. It's really nice and accessible. And to add to those, well, we know each other outside of this show. We've conversed on social media platforms like WhatsApp about HR questions. This is an industry that you live and breathe every day. You're not reading it or writing this from a glass house somewhere else. You're absolutely living it. And the book is even titled, a work in progress. It's unlocking well-being to create more sustainable and resilient organizations. So the link will be in the show notes, but it is a work in progress. You admit that it's going to change and it's always changing. And I can't recommend it enough, because it's not just, as you say, for HR and L&D professionals. This can be for anyone. I mean, as a business owner, people that just want to do this better. If we really do care about our employees or the people we work with or our families or anyone that we can be more supportive of, I really recommend they go out and get the book. As you say, it's not expensive, fantastic read. And I'm absolutely delighted that I've been able to bring you to the show to talk about it in more detail. So thanks ever much for joining me to talk about it in more detail. What I'd like to do, Gethin, if you don't mind, is just open our quick, short, sharp HR L&D vault.
Opening the L&D vault.
First question here. In hindsight, what's the one thing you now know that you wish you had known when you began your career?
Networking. It's one of the things my dad talks about all the time with his friends. My dad always thought networking was this like stupid thing that like yuppies used to do, just to go out for coffee and wine bars and stuff like that. But I mean, that made my career in many ways. It sounds really kind of saccharine to say, but it's other people, right? And I think I didn't write this book on my own. I write it with the help of everyone that contributed to it. Sure. For every customer that allowed me to do a workshop with them, for every person that buys it, for people like you for putting me on your podcast, and people who are listening to this. And so making those connections with other people has helped me get jobs when I've been made redundant, has helped me when I've really been struggling. And, I mean, stuff like that, when I was open recently with some people about what my mum was going through and how I was really struggling with that, loads of people just come out of the woodwork and support you in ways that you just didn't think. And I think that's such a valuable thing to have in your life, is other people. So, I mean, network, shake hands, kiss babies, go out for coffee. There doesn't need to be something in it for you. And I guess largely related to that, the biggest deal I've ever signed, and one of the biggest in Benefex's history, happened because I went out for coffee with somebody and we just had a chat. And yeah, I think there's so many untapped opportunities out there for all of us if we just spend more time with other people, do favors, and one day you might get those paid back.
Yeah, I love that. Well, as a recruiter, you're definitely speaking my language in terms of networking. The power of it is absolutely phenomenal. And also well done for having the trust and strength of character to talk about what you've been through with your mother as well. It's it means a lot. And I hope, obviously, that that situation goes as well as it can for you. If you can give one piece of advice to the world, what would it be?
This just came into my head. I don't quite know why I'm telling you this version, but when I was younger and I used to go on dates and things, and we were using dating apps and stuff like that, and I don't know if I searched it or whether, I don't know how I found it. I had no troubles talking, so I don't know why I would have Googled it. But it was basically this list of questions you can ask on a first date. And it just got me thinking about kind of if I sat in front of somebody that I didn't know for the first time, what would be the most important thing I wanted to get across to that person? And the one thing I settled on is, even if it doesn't seem like it at the time, and in hindsight it might not have been, I will always act in the way that I think is the best thing to do. And I ended up getting a tattoo of what comes around written on my arm, which is a line from a Johnny Cash song, The Man Comes Around. And so the man comes around is this idea that when God comes and it's, people are waiting for redemption, only the kind of good will be taken up to heaven. Now, I don't necessarily believe in God, but the sentiment of having this reminder on my wrist to always do right by people was something that always stuck with me. And I've done that to people that have treated me really badly. But by keeping that resolve, it's always come back around. And I think part of the success in other people is I've always tried to do right by other people. So I think, again, it sounds really kind of romantic to say, but I think you just have to kind of keep this resolve, keep doing the right thing. And then one day the stuff that you always wanted will start to materialize, because I think it's other people that will lift you up and other people that will get that to you. So I think always try to do the right thing, even when that's a very difficult thing to do, would be my advice to my younger self and anyone else.
Love that. Thank you very much. And last but not least, what's the guiding principle or behavior you've seen in every great leader that you've worked with?
They care. They genuinely care. I think it's easy for people to do. I think if you start to get to know your team and your team members on a personal level, I think if you start to understand why people act the way they do and what experiences they've had in life, I think that just helps you to become far more empathetic and sympathetic to them. And I think when you can be like that with people and you can understand what they're in it for and what's driving them and what the blockers are and how you can help them, I think that's when the magic happens. I think when you really get to understand people. And I think an example of that I've used in the past is if anyone ever watches these programs like First Dates, you'll sometimes see a kind of really cocky guy, like full of himself, sat at the bar and whatever. And you kind of think, oh, this guy's an idiot. And then he sits down at a table with, another guy or a girl, or whoever it might be, and then starts to open up about a challenge or maybe a death in the family or how he was brought up. And like most people, you immediately start warming to that person. You start to think, I've got to know this person now, and I just feel more empathetic. And I think, as you said at the start, opening up about imposter syndrome, that you and I talking about that has warmed me more to you, because I feel like we're connecting on a different level. And I think when managers can do that, that's when you really get to be there for your people and really care about them. And that's when you get the best out of them as well.
Sure, couldn't agree more. I think that's, you know what, we've taken that the whole show full circle here, because we know employee engagement and well-being is all about caring, showing empathy, being supportive, being able to listen, which is really, really important. Something that I've thoroughly enjoyed doing through the course of this episode, Gethin. So thank you ever so much for talking to me today on the HR L&D podcast. If people want to connect with you, if you want to find out more, I will be putting in the show notes a URL to all of Gethin's books. So if you want to get them all, please do so, and you can go straight through via the links there. I will also put a link through to Gethin's LinkedIn profile. But is there anywhere else? You mentioned Twitter, you've mentioned a couple other social networks, Gethin, you'd like to raise awareness for on the show?
Pretty active on Instagram, but that's mostly pictures of my cat and coffee and stuff. That's nothing work related, really. And Twitter I left when I learned Elon Musk was going to take it over. So I'm not on Twitter anymore, but LinkedIn's probably the best place you can reach me.
Perfect. Well, make sure LinkedIn is there as well. So those that do want to connect or find out more, get in contact with Gethin, please do use the LinkedIn URL, which I'll put in the show notes. And of course, if you're an HR L&D professional listening to the show and you have a need for an HR, HRS or L&D related vacancy and you want some specialist HR support, please do get in touch with either myself or any of my wonderful team. We'll hopefully be able to show you what a great HR recruitment experience can feel like. You can access myself at nick@jjrecruitment.com or our website, which is also jjrecruitment.com. That just leaves me to say a huge thank you again to Gethin Nadin here for joining me on the show. Thank you to all of you for listening, for tuning in as you always do. Please do share the show with all of your friends, your colleagues, your family. We can all help raise the profile of HR, the profile of leadership, the profile of caring, of empathy, and being supportive to really contribute to positive well-being together as an industry, together as a populace that listens to the show. So thank you so much. I look forward to bringing you the next episode of the HR L&D podcast real soon. Thanks once again, Gethin.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into the HR L&D podcast with your host, Nick Day, CEO of JGA Recruitment Specialist HR Recruiters. If you need any help with a current HR or L&D vacancy, then please get in touch with Nick and his team. All contact details can be found in the episode notes. In the meantime, to make sure you never miss a future episode, please subscribe to the show through any of your favorite podcast channels. Till next time.